The sun was barely a thin line on the horizon when John Weaver, an archaeologist of some renown, found himself standing on the edge of what he could only describe as an abyss. His team had been digging in the frozen tundra of northern Alaska for months, uncovering remnants of a long-lost civilization. But this yawning chasm was unlike anything they'd discovered before. An unending darkness seemed to stretch into its depths, swallowing the harsh Arctic sunlight without remorse. The sound that came from the depths was the first oddity, a continuous low hum, almost beyond the realm of human hearing. John felt it more than he heard it, the resonance vibrating in his bones. It was a primal, wrong sound, like the earth's marrow was groaning. Even more disturbing was the inexplicable climate around the hole. The ice and snow around it had melted into a soggy mire, giving the hole a 30-foot berth, and despite the freezing Arctic winds, standing near the edge felt like a balmy summer day. Days turned into weeks. Strange incidents started to pile up. Instruments stopped working or gave false readings. Compass needles spun erratically and satellite signals failed. The camp's huskies refused to go anywhere near the site, and their howling filled the still nights with dread. One night, a piercing scream echoed from the chasm. It was Harold, one of the crew members. They found his tent empty, his possessions scattered, and his footprints leading directly into the abyss. John organized a search, but no trace of Harold was found. No body, no blood, nothing. Harold's disappearance marked a turning point. The crew was filled with a pervasive sense of unease, as if they were intruders in a realm not meant for humans. John, however, was relentless. He couldn't let go. The mystery of the abyss was a siren's call to his curiosity. A week later, something else emerged from the depths. It wasn't a sound, but a force, a pressure. The very air seemed to thicken, becoming viscous and tangible, pulsating with an invisible rhythm. It was like the abyss was breathing. That same night, the fallen Harold returned. He stumbled into the camp, his eyes vacant, his lips muttering strange, incoherent syllables. His skin was horribly burnt, as if exposed to extreme heat. He wasn't the Harold they knew, but a hollow shell. The core, he kept repeating, like a broken record. That night, he died in his sleep, a peaceful expression on his face, as if he had found some profound relief in death. John finally decided to descend into the chasm. Rigged with climbing gear and armed with lights, he rappelled into the hole, a wireless camera broadcasting his descent to the terrified crew above. The deeper he went, the more oppressive the darkness became, and the stronger the strange hum. Hours passed. The abyss seemed to have no end. Then, abruptly, the line went slack. The crew on the surface watched in horror as the camera feed showed John looking at something in front of him, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. There, in the inky depths of the earth, illuminated by his shaky flashlight, was a gigantic, pulsating heart. It was entwined with veins and arteries that burrowed into the surrounding earth, its surface glossy and slick. With each beat, it sent waves of intense heat, the source of the strange climate. It was alive, connected to the earth, a grotesque mockery of life as they knew it. What have we done? John's voice was a whisper, filled with dread. As John's voice faded into the depths, the heart responded with a thunderous beat that reverberated through the chasm. The crew members on the surface clutched their ears in agony, feeling as if their very skulls were being crushed under the weight of the sound. The heart's pulsations intensified, its rhythm quickening, and the ground shook violently. Cracks spread like spider webs across the frozen landscape, swallowing tents and equipment whole. Panic gripped the remaining crew members as they scrambled to escape the crumbling campsite. Meanwhile, John found himself drawn closer to the colossal heart, unable to tear his eyes away from its mesmerizing yet horrifying presence. The heat emanating from it was oppressive, scorching his skin and searing his lungs with each breath. As he reached out a trembling hand to touch the pulsating organ, a voice echoed in his mind, a voice filled with ancient malevolence and seductive power. It whispered promises of unimaginable knowledge, untold secrets of the universe, and the chance to reshape reality itself. But there was a price, a terrible price that would forever alter his existence. Overwhelmed by the allure of the forbidden, John hesitated, his rational mind warring with an insidious curiosity. The voice grew more insistent, its tone dripping with malice, coercing him to surrender himself to the heart's dreadful embrace. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows behind John, a woman with wild, disheveled hair and a gaze filled with unyielding determination. It was Sarah, a fellow archaeologist and his closest companion on the expedition. She had managed to descend into the chasm, defying the overwhelming fear that gripped the others. "Spare yourself, John." Sarah's voice cut through the ethereal whispers, her words laden with desperation. "Can't you see? This thing, it's a parasite, a devourer of souls. It promises power, but only brings ruin." John's wavering resolve began to falter as he glimpsed the truth within Sarah's eyes. He withdrew his hand, the connection severed, the heart reacted with a thunderous bellow, its pulsations turning erratic and violent. Sarah grabbed John's arm, pulling him away from the abominable heart and urging him to ascend the rope, back toward the surface. They climbed frantically, each movement fraught with the overwhelming sense that they were being pursued by an unseen malevolence. As they neared the surface, the ground quaked violently, sending shockwaves through the ice and snow. The abyss convulsed, disgorging a horrific monstrosity, a grotesque amalgamation of sinew, bone, and pulsating flesh. Its many-eyed visage glowed with an otherworldly radiance, and its tentacle-like appendages thrashed violently, seeking prey. Sarah and John reached the surface just as the abomination breached the icy barrier. They stumbled backward, gasping for breath, their eyes widening in horror at the sight before them. The creature let out an unholy screech, piercing their eardrums and causing the surrounding landscape to crack and crumble. Then, with an unexpected burst of energy, the creature imploded, its form disintegrating into a cloud of black mist. The shockwave from its demise knocked John and Sarah off their feet, but they emerged relatively unscathed. Breathing heavily, the two survivors watched as the chasm closed before them, sealing away the heart and the unspeakable horrors it represented. They were left with only a desolate, scarred landscape as a haunting reminder of the darkness they had narrowly escaped. But as John and Sarah looked at each other, a realization dawned. The heart was not destroyed. It was merely contained, biding its time in the depths of the earth, waiting for another opportunity to ensnare unsuspecting souls. It was a quiet suburban neighborhood at night, and a cautious college student named Emily was returning home for the holidays. The winter air was chilly, and a light mist hung in the air, creating an eerie atmosphere. As she walked down the dimly lit street, she couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. Glancing over her shoulder, she noticed a figure lurking in the shadows, just a few steps behind her. Her heart skipped a beat, and a shiver ran down her spine. Emily quickened her pace, trying to dismiss her growing unease. But no matter how fast she walked, the stranger seemed to match her every step. Panic began to set in as she realized that this was no mere coincidence. She decided to confront him, summoning every ounce of courage she had left. Turning around abruptly, she locked eyes with the stranger. His piercing gaze sent a chill down her spine. With a sinister smile, he whispered in her ear, "I've been watching you for weeks." Emily's blood ran cold as she spun around, ready to confront her stalker, but he had vanished into thin air. She looked around frantically, her heart pounding in her chest. There was no sign of him anywhere. Was she losing her mind? She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being toyed with, trapped in a twisted game. Days turned into weeks, and Emily's fear grew with each passing moment. Every creak of the floorboards and every rustle of leaves outside her window made her jump. She was on constant edge, haunted by the memory of the stranger's haunting whispers. Desperate for help, she confided in her friends and family, hoping they would believe her and offer some solace. But their dismissive responses only deepened her isolation. One night, after attending a party with her friends, Emily found herself walking home alone. The streets were deserted, and the night seemed unusually silent. As she neared her house, a shadow emerged from the darkness. It was him, the stranger who had tormented her for weeks. This time, he held a gleaming knife in his hand. A scream escaped Emily's lips as she turned and sprinted with all her might. Her heart pounded in her ears, drowning out the sound of her heavy breathing. But the stranger was relentless, his footsteps closing in on her with terrifying speed. She knew she had to find help, or else she would become another victim. Just when Emily felt her legs giving way, she saw a flickering light in the distance. Relief flooded over her as she realized it was a police car, sirens blaring, racing towards her. With renewed hope, she pushed herself harder, urging her tired muscles to keep going. The stranger's heavy breathing grew more distant as he realized the police were closing in. The police car screeched to a halt, and two officers emerged, their expressions a mix of concern and determination. Emily collapsed into their arms, gasping for breath, tears streaming down her face. She pointed in the direction the stranger had fled, desperately trying to convey the danger she had faced. The officers radioed for backup and reassured Emily that she was safe now. They quickly spread out, searching the area for any trace of the stalker. Meanwhile, they escorted Emily to the safety of their patrol car and called for an ambulance to tend to her physical and emotional wounds. In the days that followed, the police conducted a thorough investigation, dedicating themselves to bringing the stalker to justice. They enlisted the help of forensic experts, interviewed witnesses, and analyzed any evidence that could lead to his capture. Eventually, their efforts paid off. The stalker, identified as a known offender with a history of stalking and harassment, was apprehended. Emily received the news with a mix of relief and lingering trauma. Knowing that her ordeal had come to an end brought her a sense of closure, but she knew the road to recovery would be long. Emily sought professional help to overcome the deep scars left by her harrowing experience. With the support of her loved ones and therapists, she gradually regained her sense of security and rebuilt her life. She became an advocate for victims of stalking, sharing her story to raise awareness and empower others to speak out against such heinous acts. Ellen, a young woman in her 20s, worked the graveyard shift at Mercy Hospital. The only available bus ran until midnight, forcing her to trek back home through the dimly lit, desolate urban maze of New York City. Her apartment was 6 blocks away, but those blocks felt like miles under the moonless sky. One particular night, after a long and grueling shift, she felt the air was heavier than usual. There was a tension she could not shake off, a sensation of being watched. She looked back down the path she'd come from and saw nothing but an empty road bathed in sporadic lamplight. Then, from the shadowy alleys, a man emerged. At first, he was just a silhouette, a shifting shape amid the darkness. But as he stepped into the light, she could see his sunken eyes, hollow cheeks, and a strange, twisted smile. His gaze was fixed on her, making her blood run cold. He started to follow her, matching her steps, his silhouette stretching and morphing under the flickering streetlights. Part 2, the sinister pursuit. In fear, she quickened her pace, but the sound of his footsteps only grew louder. Her heart pounded in her chest as she began to run, her breath hitching. She could feel him closing in on her, his presence a haunting echo that resonated through the empty street. She darted down alleyways, her heels clattering against the wet asphalt. Yet he continued to pursue her, his panting growing more excited with every corner she turned. His footfalls echoed through the quiet streets, growing in intensity until they were the only thing she could hear. The city was silent, and in its silence, his pursuit became even more terrifying. Part II, the final showdown. Finally, Ellen reached her apartment building, its looming facade bathed in the glow of a solitary streetlight. The relief was short-lived. She fumbled with her keys, her trembling hands barely managing to push the key into the lock. His heavy footsteps were getting louder, closer. Sweat trickled down her spine as the echo of the shoes crunching gravel quickened. She was just about to push open the door when she felt his breath on her neck, heard a soft, guttural chuckle. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. In a sudden burst of adrenaline, she spun around, her hand reaching into her pocket and retrieving a small canister of pepper spray. She released it right into his face. He howled in agony, his hands clawing at his eyes. Part IV, the dawn of safety. Before he could recover, Ellen bolted through the entrance, slamming the heavy iron door behind her. She heard him pound against it, his screams reverberating through the cold night air. She collapsed against the door, her body shaking, her breath coming in short gasps. Suddenly, the apartment building was filled with flashing red and blue lights. The neighbors, alarmed by the commotion, had called the police. Ellen watched through the peephole as they apprehended the man writhing on the ground, blinded and disoriented. As they cuffed him, she allowed herself a small sigh of relief, her body finally beginning to relax. As the sun peeked over the horizon, bathing the city in a warm glow, Ellen realized her nightmare was over. Though she knew she would never forget the chilling echo of those footsteps.